I know him. Judge's heart-stopping moment. Recognizing defendant from her past. Emotional courtroom drama. Drop your thoughts below. I want to know what this touched and where you're watching from. The courtroom was buzzing, a hive of hushed expectancy. Papers shuffled, like dry leaves skittering in a nervous wind. Spectators whispered their words like muffled drum beats in the tense air. You could practically taste the anticipation, thick and metallic like a penny on your tongue. Out in the hall, another gavel slammed down. Thwack! A sound like a judge's fist on a table. But here, in this courtroom, it was all hell breath and coiled springs. Amelia Brennan sat on the bench, her gaze steady, professional, a mask she'd perfected over years of dealing with the broken and the desperate. Another day, another case. That's what she told herself. Just another crack in the Liberty Bell of justice. The state of Georgia versus Marcus Jefferson, the bailiff's voice boomed, echoing in the high-ceilinged room. Amelia shifted, the leather of her chair groaning softly beneath her. Her hands, resting on the polished oak, felt strangely cold. She scanned the charges: assault, robbery, resisting arrest, the usual trifecta of despair. A familiar ache, a dull throb of disappointment settled in her chest. Another brother swallowed by the system, she thought, that old bitter taste of futility coating her tongue. Then he was brought in, and the carefully constructed world of Judge Amelia Brennan, the impartial arbiter of justice, fractured like a dropped mirror. The man standing before her, wrists and ankles shackled, wasn't some stranger, some nameless face in the endless parade of the accused. This was Marcus. Her throat constricted, a fist squeezing the air from her lungs. Memories, vivid and sharp as shards of glass, flooded her mind. Summer afternoons racing bikes down the red clay roads of Athens, dust devils swirling behind them like miniature tornadoes, late night talks under the sprawling branches of the old oak tree in her backyard, whispering secrets and dreams into the humid Georgia night. Promises made, etched in the naive certainty of youth, that they'd always have each other's backs, no matter what. Ride or die, they say now. It was stick together through thick and thin in that time. But the man before her, this wasn't the boy she remembered. This Marcus had shoulders slumped like a weary atlas, his face etched with the hard lines of a life lived on the margins. A life that had clearly taken a wrong turn somewhere, veered off the hopeful path they had imagined together. But his eyes, those deep-set, soulful eyes, the color of dark roast coffee, those were unmistakable. They were Marcus's eyes, holding a universe of untold stories. Amelia's grip on the gavel, her symbol of authority, of order, faltered. For the first time in her career, she hesitated. The courtroom, normally a vast echoing space, seemed to shrink, the walls closing in like a tightening vice. She felt trapped, suffocated by the weight of the impossible. Marcus looked up. His expression was a complex cocktail of emotions: shock, resignation, and something else. Recognition? It flickered in his eyes, a brief spark before he quickly averted his gaze, his head bowing slightly as if in shame or perhaps defeat. He looked like a man who'd been knocked down too many times to count. The courtroom waited, a silent, expectant beast. Amelia forced herself to speak, her voice a strained whisper that amplified in the sudden hush. "Mr. Jefferson, you stand accused of assault and robbery. How do you plead?" His voice, when it came, was rough, gravelly, almost unrecognizable. The voice of a stranger. "Not guilty, Your Honor." The words sound almost like a foreign language. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a trapped bird desperate for escape. She wanted to call a halt, to scream, "Stop! This is all wrong!" She wanted to demand answers, to unravel the tangled threads of fate that had led them here, to this impossible moment. "What happened to you, Marcus? How did we end up on opposite sides of this chasm?" But the black robe, the weight of her office, the expectations of the court, they held her captive. "Proceed," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. a thin veneer of composure over a churning sea of turmoil. As the prosecutor, a sharp-suited shark named David Callahan began his opening statement, outlining the state's case with cold, clinical precision, Amelia's mind raced. This wasn't just another case. This was Marcus. And somehow she had to navigate this impossible labyrinth, to separate the shattered remnants of her past from the stark realities of her present before the weight of it all crushed her and him completely. It felt like trying to hold back a flood with a teaspoon. The courtroom, with its sterile formality, seemed to dissolve around Amelia. Callahan's voice, droning on about evidence and procedure, faded into a distant hum. Her mind was adrift, swept away on a tide of memory, back to a time long before the black robes and the gavel, before the weight of the world had settled on their young shoulders. She and Marcus had grown up on opposite sides of the tracks in Athens, Georgia, a town where the Mason-Dixon line might as well have been drawn right down the middle of Main Street. It wasn't about distance. It was about the unspoken rules, the invisible barriers that separated black and white, rich and poor. Her family's house was a modest but comfortable one-story with a white picket fence, the picture-perfect image of small-town American respectability. Marcus's family lived in a weathered, clapboard house at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by fields of cotton and soybeans. A landscape that spoke of a different kind of history, a different kind of struggle. A world away, though only a few miles separated them. Their friendship had been an anomaly, a glitch in the matrix of their segregated world. She remembered their first meeting with a clarity that surprised her. It was an accident, a chance encounter at the edge of a creek where she'd wandered, restless and bored, too far from her own backyard. Marcus had been fishing, his line hopelessly tangled in the reeds, his brow furrowed in concentration. She'd offered to help, a simple act of kindness, a child's instinctive empathy, and that simple gesture had blossomed unexpectedly into years of shared secrets, whispered dreams, and adventures that felt both exhilarating and forbidden. "Amelia," he'd said to her once, lying on their backs in a field of wildflowers, staring up at the vast Georgia sky, a canvas of endless blue dotted with puffy white clouds. "You ever think about busting out of this place? Like really getting going? Going somewhere where folks don't look at you sideways just 'cause you're sitting next to someone who don't look like you?" He wasn't talking about college. He was talking about the world. She'd laughed then, a light, carefree sound, brushing off the idea as childish fantasy. But Marcus hadn't been joking. Even then, as a kid, he'd seen the world for what it was, a place that wasn't always fair, a place that often drew lines in the sand and told you where you belonged, based on nothing more than the color of your skin. He had that woke sense about him. He got the system, even back then. Their bond deepened despite the whispers, the sideways glances, the outright disapproval from both sides. It was like they were magnets, drawn together by an invisible force, defying the gravity of their divided town. But the pressure was always there, a constant, suffocating weight, like the humid Georgia air before a thunderstorm. You could feel it, taste it, see it in the narrowed eyes and pursed lips of the adults. And then one day, predictably, it all came crashing down. The summer before high school, that pivotal moment when childhood innocence begins to give way to the harsh realities of the adult world. Her father had caught them sitting on the porch swing together, sharing a stolen Coca-Cola and laughing about something silly. His voice had been like ice, sharp and brittle, shattering the easy camaraderie of the moment. "Amelia, get inside. Now." It wasn't a request, it was a command laced with an unspoken threat. She'd hesitated, glancing at Marcus, who stood frozen, his face a mask of stoic resignation. He knew the drill. "Go on," he'd said quietly, his voice barely a whisper, tinged with a sadness that had pierced her heart. "It's cool. I'll catch you later." But they hadn't caught each other later. Not really. Her father, a man who prided himself on being fair but who also believed in staying in your lane, had forbidden her from seeing Marcus. And soon after, with a swiftness that felt like a betrayal, Marcus's family had moved away. Vanished. like smoke in the wind. Rumor had it they'd gone up north, seeking a better life, a place where the color of their skin wouldn't be a constant barrier. Amelia had thrown herself into school, channeling her grief and confusion into academic achievement. She'd excelled, driven by a fierce ambition to escape Athens, to prove herself, to make a difference. She'd gone to law school, chasing the elusive ideal of justice, of fairness, of a world where everyone had a voice, a chance. But she'd never forgotten Marcus, the boy who had taught her about courage, about resilience, about the quiet strength that it takes to stand up for what you believe in, even when the whole world is telling you to sit down. Now, sitting on the bench, the weight of her judge's robes feeling heavier than ever, she wondered what had happened to Marcus after that day, after she walked into that house and closed the door on their childhood friendship. His record, a stark, impersonal document, showed a string of arrests for minor offenses. Petty theft, loitering, disturbing the peace, nothing that screamed violent criminal, nothing that hinted at the charges he now faced. But then again, how much of a person's soul could you see in a few lines on a rap sheet? It was like trying to understand the ocean by looking at a single drop of water. Callahan's voice, sharp and insistent, finally penetrated the fog of her memories, snapping her back to the present. He was describing the alleged crime, painting a picture of Marcus as a dangerous, desperate man who had assaulted a store clerk during a robbery at a convenience store in Atlanta. The clerk, a Mr. Thompson, had suffered minor injuries and the cash register had been emptied. Marcus had been picked up a few blocks away, the cash allegedly still in his possession. It was a neat, tidy package, all tied up with a bow of circumstantial evidence. Amelia studied Marcus as Callahan spoke. His posture was still slouched, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, but his expression was unreadable. It was like he was wearing a mask, hiding his true feelings behind a wall of carefully constructed indifference. Did he really do it? The question echoed in her mind, a relentless, nagging doubt. Or was there more to the story, layers of complexity that the prosecution's neat narrative conveniently ignored? Was this the work of a hardened criminal or a desperate man backed into a corner? Now, sitting on the bench, the weight of her judge's robes feeling heavier than ever, she wondered what had happened to Marcus after that day. After she'd walked into that house and closed the door on their childhood friendship. His record, a stark, impersonal document, showed a string of arrests for minor offenses. Petty theft, loitering, disturbing the peace. Nothing that screamed violent criminal, nothing that hinted at the charges he now faced. But then again, how much of a person's soul could you see in a few lines on a rap sheet? It was like trying to understand the ocean by looking at a single drop of water. Callahan's voice, sharp and insistent, finally penetrated the fog of her memories, snapping her back to the present. He was describing the alleged crime, painting a picture of Marcus as a dangerous, desperate man who had assaulted a store clerk during a robbery at a convenience store in Atlanta. The clerk, a Mr. Thompson, had suffered minor injuries and the cash register had been emptied. Marcus had been picked up a few blocks away, the cash allegedly still in his possession. It was a neat, tidy package, all tied up with a bow of circumstantial evidence. Amelia studied Marcus as Callahan spoke. His posture was still slouched, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, but his expression was unreadable. It was like he was wearing a mask, hiding his true feelings behind a wall of carefully constructed indifference. Did he really do it? The question echoed in her mind, a relentless, nagging doubt. Or was there more to the story? Layers of complexity that the prosecution's neat narrative conveniently ignored. Was this the work of a hardened criminal or a desperate man backed into a corner? The courtroom adjourned for a lunch break, a temporary reprieve from the suffocating tension. It was like the bell ringing between rounds of a brutal boxing match. Amelia needed a moment to gather her thoughts, to try and reconcile the Marcus she knew with the man accused of these crimes. As she retreated to her chambers, her assistant, Sarah, a young woman with a keen eye and a sympathetic heart, approached her hesitantly. "Judge Brennan, are you all right? You seem A little off, Sarah asked, her voice laced with concern. Amelia hesitated. Should she confide in Sarah? Would it be a breach of protocol, a betrayal of her judicial impartiality to admit that she knew the defendant, that her past was tangled up with his present? The rules of this game were clear. Objectivity, detachment, a blind eye to anything outside the evidence presented. But this wasn't just a case. It was a collision of two worlds, a reckoning with a past she thought she'd buried. Instead, she offered a weak smile, a practiced mask of composure. I'm fine, Sarah. Just a lot on my mind. A lie. A necessary lie, perhaps, but a lie nonetheless. But she wasn't fine. How could she be? The past she'd tried so hard to compartmentalize, to lock away in a dusty corner of her memory, was now sitting just a few feet away in shackles, his fate hanging in the balance, dependent on her judgment. It felt like a cruel joke, a twisted irony that fate had thrown them together again in this adversarial arena. The courtroom was packed when the trial resumed, a sea of faces, a gallery of judgment. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, their pens scratching like frantic insects. Mr. Thompson, looking shaky and nervous, shuffled papers at the witness stand. And David Callahan, the prosecutor, was a coiled spring, ready to pounce to deliver his carefully crafted narrative of guilt. He was going for the jugular. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Callahan began, his voice resonating with the practiced confidence of a seasoned performer. This case is about violence. It's about a man who walked into a convenience store and, without provocation, attacked an innocent clerk before stealing the contents of the cash register. The evidence will show, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Marcus Jefferson is guilty of this crime. He spoke with the smooth, rehearsed cadence of a preacher delivering a sermon, his words designed to sway, to convince, to condemn. Amelia felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Callahan's tone was so clinical, so detached, as if Marcus were nothing more than a case number, a statistic, a nameless, faceless perp. It was as if he were talking about an object, not a human being. She glanced at Marcus, whose gaze remained fixed on the table before him, his expression unreadable, a blank slate onto which the jury could project their own biases and assumptions. He was playing it cool, but she could see the tension in the set of his jaw. Olivia Ramirez, the defense attorney, rose to present her opening statement. She was young, but there was a fire in her eyes, a steely determination that belied her age. Her voice, though not as booming as Callahan's, carried across the room with a quiet intensity. The prosecution would have you believe this case is open and shut, a slam dunk, but it's not. It's anything but, she stated, her voice ringing with conviction. My client, Marcus Jefferson, has maintained his innocence from the start. We will show that there is far more to this story than meets the eye, and that the assumptions made on the night of the arrest simply do not hold up under scrutiny. This isn't about beyond a reasonable doubt. It's about reasonable doubt itself. The first witness was called. Mr. Thompson, the store clerk who had allegedly been assaulted. He described, in halting, nervous tones, seeing a man matching Marcus's description enter the store, argue with the cashier himself, and then lunge over the counter, grabbing at the cash register. His testimony was detailed, but it felt rehearsed, like a script he'd memorized, a story he'd been told to tell. There was a hollowness to it, a lack of genuine emotion that made Amelia uneasy. Olivia Ramirez's cross-examination was like a surgeon's scalpel, precise, incisive, and aimed at exposing the flaws in the witness's account. Mr. Thompson, you stated that the man who attacked you was wearing a red hoodie. Is that correct? Yes, the witness replied, fidgeting with his tie. Did you see his face clearly? Not really. It was dark and, he had the hood up. It all happened so fast. Olivia nodded slowly, pacing back and forth in front of the jury box. So you're saying you couldn't definitively identify the individual who committed the assault? Well, no, but... Mr. Thompson stammered, his voice trailing off. No further questions, Olivia said, cutting him off with a decisive flick of her wrist. It was a small victory, but a significant one. She planted the seed of doubt. Amelia noticed Marcus shift slightly in his seat, his shoulders seeming to square just a fraction, as if Olivia's words had given him a flicker of hope, a tiny spark in the darkness. The next piece of evidence was a surveillance video from the store. It was grainy, poorly lit, a blurry mess of shadows and movement. It showed a figure in a red hoodie entering the store, a brief scuffle at the counter, and then the figure fleeing. The prosecution argued that this figure was, without a doubt, Marcus Jefferson. But the quality of the video was so poor, so ambiguous, that it was impossible to discern any identifying features. It could have been anyone. It was like looking at a Rorschach test. You saw what you wanted to see. As the video played, Amelia studied it intently, her brow furrowed in concentration. Could this truly be Marcus? The figure moved quickly with a kind of desperate urgency, grabbing at the counter before disappearing off screen. The footage ended abruptly, leaving a gaping hole in the narrative, a void where certainty should have been. It was like a puzzle with missing pieces, a story with a crucial chapter ripped out. Marcus's defense was based on an alibi. He claimed he'd been walking home from a friend's house at the time of the robbery. The friend, however, was unwilling to testify, citing fear of retaliation from the community, a euphemism, Amelia suspected, for the unspoken code of silence that often prevailed in marginalized communities, a fear of getting involved, of becoming a target. Olivia argued that the lack of a corroborating witness didn't automatically negate Marcus's claim of innocence, but the jury's expressions, a mixture of skepticism and suspicion, suggested they weren't entirely convinced. It was an uphill battle, a fight against a system that often seemed stacked against people like Marcus. As the trial wore on, Amelia felt the weight of her position, the crushing responsibility of her role, pressing down on her like a physical burden. She was supposed to be impartial, a neutral arbiter, a blindfolded Lady Justice holding the scales of truth. But how could she be impartial when every moment, every testimony, every piece of evidence was a painful reminder of her shared past with the defendant? The boy who had once been her closest friend, her confidant, her partner in crime, the innocent childhood kind, was now a man fighting for his freedom, his future, and she was the one tasked with determining his fate. It was a cruel twist of fate, a burden almost too heavy to bear. When court adjourned for the day, the setting sun cast long, somber shadows across the courtroom, mirroring the growing unease within Amelia. She lingered at the bench, her fingers tracing the smooth, worn edges of the gavel, the wood cool beneath her touch. It felt less like a symbol of authority and more like a heavy weight, a reminder of the immense power she wielded, and the potential for that power to cause irreparable harm. She wanted, needed to talk to Marcus, to look him in the eye, to ask him straight up what really happened that night, but she couldn't. Any contact outside the formal confines of the courtroom would be a violation, a breach of ethics that could jeopardize the entire case, destroy her career, and, most importantly, further damage Marcus's chances. It was a legal and ethical minefield. As she watched Marcus being escorted out of the room, the clinking of his shackles echoing in the near-empty space, a wave of frustration, of helplessness washed over her. She'd always believed in the justice system, in its ability to sift through the lies, the half-truths, the biases to arrive at the truth. But for the first time, she found herself questioning that belief, wondering if the truth was something too elusive, too complex, too easily obscured by the machinery of the law. It was the defense's turn to present their case, and Olivia Ramirez wasted no time in going on the offensive. She called her first key witness, Officer Robert Miller, the arresting officer. This was where the carefully constructed narrative of the prosecution might begin to unravel. Amelia leaned forward slightly, her gaze focused, her senses heightened. Officer Miller, a burly man with a gruff demeanor and a seen-it-all attitude, took the stand, radiating a kind of weary cynicism. He looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Olivia approached him with a deliberate calm, a quiet confidence that was more effective than any bluster. "Officer Miller," she began, her voice clear and steady, "you were the arresting officer in this case, correct?" That's right, he replied, his tone clipped, almost dismissive. You stated in your report that Mr. Jefferson was walking 2 blocks from the scene of the robbery when you detained him. Is that correct? Yeah. And what led you to believe he was the suspect? Miller shifted in his seat, his eyes flickering towards the prosecution table. He fit the description. Black male, mid-40s, wearing dark clothing. It was the same tired refrain, the same lazy shorthand that had condemned countless black men before Marcus. Olivia's eyebrows arched slightly, a subtle expression of disbelief. Dark clothing? But the suspect in the video, the one Mr. Thompson described, was wearing a red hoodie. Did you find a red hoodie in Mr. Jefferson's possession when you searched him? Miller hesitated, his jaw tightening. Number, but he could have ditched it, thrown it away somewhere. Olivia took a step closer, her voice taking on a sharper edge. Coulda? Did you or any other officer conduct a thorough search of the surrounding area to locate this supposedly discarded red hoodie? Miller's face reddened slightly, his composure beginning to crack. Nah, we didn't have time for that. We apprehended him quickly. Case closed. He sounded almost defensive, as if justifying his actions to himself as much as to the court. Olivia pressed on, her voice relentless. So, to clarify, Officer Miller, you arrested my client based on a vague, generic description, without any concrete physical evidence linking him to the scene of the crime. You just saw a black man walking down the street and decided he was your guy? The officer's silence was deafening. It hung in the air, a damning indictment of his actions, of his assumptions, of the systemic biases that permeated the entire criminal justice system. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes, that screamed injustice louder than any shouted protest. Amelia's gaze flickered to the jury. Several members were exchanging uneasy glances, their faces reflecting a growing sense of doubt, of discomfort. The seed that Olivia had planted earlier was beginning to sprout. Olivia wasn't finished. Officer Miller, do you recall if Mr. Jefferson said anything at the time of his arrest? Yeah, he said the usual BS. I didn't do it. You got the wrong guy. They all say that. And did you at any point consider investigating his claim, exploring the possibility that he might in fact be innocent? Or did you simply assume his guilt based solely on his appearance, on the color of his skin? It was a loaded question, a direct challenge to the officer's integrity, to the very foundation of his police work. Miller's face was now a mask of anger and resentment. I followed procedure, he mumbled, his voice barely audible. Procedure, Olivia repeated, her voice dripping with skepticism. Or prejudice? A pin could drop. That is how quiet it became. No further questions, Your Honor. The courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations as Officer Miller stepped down, his credibility shattered, his testimony leaving a gaping hole in the prosecution's case. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest. This was more than just a trial now. It was a public dissection of a flawed system, a system that too often prioritized expediency over justice, assumptions over evidence, a system that seemed all too eager to condemn Marcus Jefferson not because of what he'd done, but because of who he was. It was a reckoning, not just for Marcus, but for everyone in that courtroom, including herself. The defense's next move was a calculated risk, a bold gambit that could either make or break their case. Olivia Ramirez called an expert witness, Dr. Anya Sharma, a forensic analyst specializing in video and image enhancement. This was a direct challenge to the prosecution's key piece of evidence, the blurry, ambiguous surveillance footage. Dr. Sharma, a woman of sharp intellect and unwavering confidence, explained in clear, concise terms the limitations of the video. She pointed out the poor lighting, the low resolution, the grainy texture, all of which made it impossible to definitively identify the individual in the red hoodie. Based on my analysis, she stated, her voice calm and authoritative, there is simply no way to conclusively determine with any degree of scientific certainty that the person in this video is Mr. Jefferson. The height, the build, the gait, They're all within a range of possibility, but they're not unique. It's like trying to identify someone based on a blurry shadow. You can make educated guesses, but you can't be sure. But Dr. Sharma wasn't finished. She had uncovered something even more damning. The timestamp on the video, the digital marker that indicated the precise time of the recording, had been altered. It was a subtle manipulation, a digital sleight of hand that could easily have gone unnoticed, but it raised serious questions about the integrity of the entire video, about its admissibility as evidence. The metadata, she explained using the technical term for the embedded information within the video file, shows that the timestamp was modified after the initial recording. This suggests that the video may have been tampered with, potentially to align it with the prosecution's narrative. The courtroom erupted in a murmur of shocked disbelief. The prosecution, caught off guard, attempted to dismiss Dr. Sharma's testimony as mere conjecture, speculation without basis, but the damage was done. The seed of doubt had not only sprouted, it had blossomed into a full-blown tree of suspicion, its branches casting a long shadow over the entire case. The jury looked shaken, their faith in the seemingly irrefutable evidence visibly eroded. As the day drew to a close, the moment of truth arrived. Marcus Jefferson, against the advice of his own attorney, decided to take the stand. It was a high-stakes gamble, a desperate attempt to reclaim his narrative, to tell his side of the story, to connect with the jury on a human level. Olivia had warned him of the risks, of the potential for the prosecution to twist his words, to exploit his past mistakes, but Marcus was adamant. He wanted to be heard. He stood, the chains clinking softly as he approached the stand, a sound that seemed to amplify the silence in the room. His voice, though quiet, carried a raw, unfiltered sincerity, a palpable sense of desperation. He wasn't polished or articulate like the lawyers. He spoke in the plain, unvarnished language of a man who had nothing left to lose. He spoke like a man tired of being gamed by the system. "I've made mistakes in my life," he began, looking directly at the jury, his eyes meeting theirs one by one. "I ain't gonna lie about that. I've taken some wrong turns, hung out with the wrong crowd, made some bad choices. I've been down on my luck, scraped the bottom more times than I care to remember, but I didn't do this. I'm not a violent man. I'm not a thief." He paused, taking a deep breath, his chest heaving with emotion. "That night, I was walking home from a friend's place. It was late, I was tired, and I just wanted to get back to my apartment. That's all. And then the cops stopped me. They didn't ask me any questions. They didn't give me a chance to explain. They just saw a black man walking down the street, and they decided I fit the bill. They decided I was guilty." His voice cracked slightly, a tremor of vulnerability breaking through his carefully constructed facade of stoicism. "I've been fighting my whole life, Hisham," he continued, his voice rising in intensity. "Fighting to be seen as something more than just a stereotype, more than just a statistic. Fighting to be treated like a human being with dignity, with respect, but this is different. This is my life on the line. I'm tired. I'm tired of fighting. I just want the truth to matter. I just want y'all to see me, to see the truth." He sat back down, his shoulders slumping, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of lived experience, of systemic injustice, of a lifetime of being judged, of being presumed guilty. It was a plea, not just for acquittal, but for understanding, for empathy, for a recognition of his basic humanity. Amelia's throat tightened, a lump forming that made it difficult to swallow. She glanced at the jury, their faces a kaleidoscope of emotions: doubt, sympathy, confusion, uncertainty. They were grappling with the weight of his words, with the stark contrast between the prosecution's portrayal of him as a dangerous criminal and the man who stood before them, vulnerable, flawed, but undeniably human. This was it, the moment of truth. The scales of justice were trembling, precariously balanced between guilt and innocence, between assumption and evidence, between prejudice and fairness. The truth was no longer a simple, straightforward equation. It was a complex, messy, deeply human story, a battle of conscience, a struggle against the ingrained biases that permeated every corner of society. And Amelia knew that her role, her responsibility, was not just to uphold the law, but to interpret it, to apply it in a way that served true justice, a justice that recognized the humanity of every individual, regardless of their race, their background, their past mistakes. The system was on trial as much as Marcus was. The final day of the trial dawned, heavy with a sense of impending finality. The air in the courtroom crackled with anticipation, thick with the unspoken question that hung over everyone's heads: guilty or not guilty? The closing arguments were delivered with the precision and passion of a finely tuned orchestra, each side playing their final, desperate notes. David Callahan, the prosecutor, his voice sharp and forceful, leaned heavily on the circumstantial evidence, urging the jury to trust the process, to rely on the facts as presented, to see Marcus Jefferson as the dangerous criminal he painted him to be. "Don't be fooled by emotion," he warned, his gaze sweeping across the jury box. "Focus on the evidence. The evidence points to one conclusion: guilt." He was playing the law and order card, appealing to their fears, their biases, their preconceived notions. Olivia Ramirez, in her closing statement, took a different approach. She pleaded with the jury to see beyond the surface, to look past the stereotypes, the assumptions, the easy answers, and to consider the gaping holes in the prosecution's case, the lack of concrete evidence, the questionable testimony, the very real possibility of reasonable doubt. "This isn't about whether Marcus Jefferson is a perfect human being," she argued, her voice ringing with conviction. "It's about whether the state has proven beyond a reasonable doubt that he committed this specific crime, and they haven't. They've presented a narrative built on shaky foundations, on assumptions, on a rush to judgment. They've asked you to fill in the blanks with your own biases, your own fears. But that's not justice. That's prejudice." She paused, letting her words sink in, her gaze locking with each juror's in turn. "Don't let fear dictate your decision. Don't let prejudice blind you to the truth. Look at the evidence, or rather the lack of evidence. Look at the man sitting before you, not as a stereotype, but as a human being. And ask yourselves, is there reasonable doubt? I submit to you that there is. Plenty of it." She was appealing to their sense of fairness, their humanity, their ability to see beyond the surface. Amelia listened intently, her face impassive, a neutral mask concealing the turmoil raging within her. Her role was clear. She could not, must not, attempt to sway the jury, to influence their decision in any way. But she knew that if their verdict left room for interpretation, if it came down to a question of law, of procedure, of the nuances of justice, then the ultimate responsibility would fall on her shoulders. The weight of that responsibility felt almost unbearable. The jury deliberated for hours. It felt like an eternity. The courtroom emptied and refilled, a restless ebb and flow of anxious energy. People stretched their legs, whispered among themselves, speculated endlessly about the outcome. The tension was palpable, a thick, suffocating blanket that seemed to smother everyone in the room. Marcus sat quietly at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, his gaze fixed on some distant point, as if lost in his own thoughts, his own fears, his own hopes. He hadn't looked at Amelia since that first shocking moment of recognition, and she couldn't blame him. What could she possibly say to him? How could she explain the impossible position she was in, the conflict between her past and her present, her personal feelings and her professional duty? There were no words, no easy answers, only the agonizing weight of the decision that loomed before them. Finally, the bailiff announced, his voice booming through the hushed courtroom, that the jury had reached a verdict. The room fell silent, every eye fixed on the foreperson, a middle-aged woman with a serious expression, a piece of paper trembling slightly in her hand. It was the kind of silence that made your ears ring. A silence pregnant with anticipation, with dread, with the potential for both triumph and despair. In the case of the state of Georgia versus Marcus Jefferson, she read, her voice clear and steady. On the charge of assault, we find the defendant. The pause was excruciating, a moment stretched out to infinity, a knife edge of suspense. Not guilty. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom, followed by a wave of murmurs, a mix of disbelief, relief, and, in some corners, outrage. A few people cheered, a spontaneous eruption of pent-up emotion. Amelia tapped her gavel sharply, restoring order, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt a wave of relief wash over her, a loosening of the knot that had been tightening in her stomach for days. But it was a complicated relief, tinged with sadness, with the awareness that this victory, however hard won, was only a small battle in a much larger war. Marcus's shoulders sagged, as if a tremendous weight had been lifted, but his face remained unreadable, his expression a complex mix of emotions that Amelia couldn't quite decipher. He had won his freedom, at least for now, but it was clear that this victory came at a cost. The scars of this ordeal, the trauma of being accused, of being judged, of being forced to fight for his life, would likely stay with him forever. It wasn't a win. It was more like surviving a near-death experience. Amelia addressed the court, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. The jury has spoken. Mr. Jefferson, you are free to go. Court is adjourned. The words felt hollow, inadequate, a pale reflection of the profound impact of what had just transpired. As the courtroom emptied, a chaotic swirl of reporters, spectators, and legal personnel, Amelia lingered behind, her gaze fixed on Marcus. He was signing his release paperwork, the mundane bureaucracy of freedom a stark contrast to the dramatic events that had just unfolded. For a moment, she thought he might leave without a word, disappear back into the anonymity of the city, another case closed, another file tucked away. And perhaps a part of her hoped he would. It would be easier that way, less painful. But then he turned and approached her. The room was nearly deserted now, only a few clerks tidying up, Sarah gathering files at a nearby desk. The silence felt heavy, charged with unspoken words, with the ghosts of their shared past. Marcus stopped a few feet from the bench, his expression guarded, his eyes searching hers, as if looking for answers to questions he couldn't quite articulate. He looked tired, drained, but there was also a flicker of something else in his eyes, a hint of defiance, of resilience, of the enduring spirit that had kept him going through it all. You don't owe me nothing, he said quietly, his voice raspy, his words carrying the weight of years, of experience, of a life lived on the margins. But I just want to know, why didn't you say anything? You knew me. It wasn't an accusation, but a question, a plea for understanding. Amelia felt her throat tighten, the words catching like fish bones. How could she explain the complexities of her position, the ethical constraints, the impossible tightrope she'd been forced to walk? Because I couldn't, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I had to be fair. I had to be impartial. If I'd said something, if I'd revealed our connection, it would have jeopardized the entire case. It could have gotten the whole thing thrown out, and you might have ended up worse off. It was a no-win situation. Marcus studied her, his face a complex tapestry of emotions, hurt, understanding, resignation, and perhaps a flicker of forgiveness. Fair, he repeated, the word laced with a bitter irony. That's the damn thing, Amelia. The world ain't never been fair. Not to folks like me. It's always been stacked against us. The system, it's rigged. You know that. She nodded slowly, her gaze dropping to the polished wood of the bench, the smooth, unblemished surface a stark contrast to the messy, complicated reality of the world outside. You're right, she admitted, her voice heavy with the weight of that realization. I know that now. I wish I'd done more back then. I wish I could have done more now. I wish I could have. She trailed off, unable to articulate the depth of her regret, the frustration, the helplessness she felt. Marcus sighed, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. We were kids, Amelia. We didn't know no better. We were just trying to survive in a world that didn't want us to be friends. But you know now, don't you? You see it. You see how it works. I do, she said, her voice firm, her resolve hardening. And I'm sorry, Marcus. For everything. The words felt inadequate, a paltry offering in the face of the injustice he'd endured. But they were all she had. Marcus gave a faint nod, a gesture of acknowledgement, perhaps even of acceptance. Then he turned and walked away, his back straight, his head held high, disappearing through the heavy courthouse doors, back into the uncertain future that awaited him. Amelia sat alone in the empty courtroom, the silence pressing in on her. The weight of his words, of his experience settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. She had upheld the law, she had followed procedure, she had ensured that, at least in this one case, justice had been served. But the trial had revealed a deeper truth, a more uncomfortable reality, that justice wasn't just about verdicts and evidence, about rules and regulations. It was about the lives that were shaped by those systems, by those rules, by the often unconscious biases that permeated every aspect of society. For Amelia, it was a wake-up call, a profound and unsettling realization that her position as a judge wasn't just a seat of power, a symbol of authority. It was a platform, a responsibility, a chance to make a real difference, to challenge the status quo, to fight for a more just and equitable world. She couldn't change the past. She couldn't undo the wrongs that had been done, but she could and would do everything in her power to ensure that the future held more than just empty promises, more than just hollow rhetoric about fairness and equality. As she left the courtroom that evening, the fading sunlight casting long shadows across the courthouse steps, Amelia made a silent vow. It would be a long, hard road, an uphill battle against ingrained prejudice, systemic injustice, and the inertia of the status quo. It might even be impossible, but she owed it to Marcus, to all the countless others who had been caught in the gears of a flawed system, and most importantly, she owed it to herself, to the ideals she'd sworn to uphold, to try. She would use her power, her position, her voice to fight for a better future, a future where justice wasn't just a word but a reality. The fight was just beginning.